Hey everybody, welcome back to Record-ology. I'm really excited about this because it marks a return to our Record-ology roots, and we're kind of stepping away from reviewing some of the non-vinyl related things a bit. We've been doing a lot of extra stuff, and I feel like we've sort of stepped a little bit too far away from our bread and butter, but not so today. We are back in the thick of it again with a show about fake stereo vinyl records. What is fake stereo? How can you be prepared to avoid them? Unless you like them, how can you be prepared to find them? What is it? How does it work? And we're going to listen to some sound samples near the end of the show as well. Anyway, my friends, like I said, you're not going to want to miss this. Okay, it feels good to be back on the full resolution 4K Sony camera. When I was editing that show, Shot on the Flip, I was like, oh man, this is rough. This is rough. And I'm thinking when I was filming, like 720p is pretty good. I had never really seen the footage out of that thing until then. But now, optics are a big thing. I will say that, not just the image sensor. But it was an interesting experiment. I don't think we'll repeat that, but it was an interesting experiment. Thank you for suffering through that with me. Anyway, today we're here to talk about fake stereo. This is something we haven't talked about on the channel for years, so I figured it was time to revisit the subject and perhaps explain it a little better. If you're new to vinyl and you're like, what is fake stereo and why should I care? Well, I'm going to explain exactly what it is, how you can be on the lookout for it, and I'm going to demonstrate it compared to non-fake stereo. So the first thing is, why does fake stereo exist? The reason is, from time to time, when formats are competing against each other, sometimes older technologies will be made somewhat compliant with newer trendy technologies. In the case of records, older monaural recordings, such as Glenn Miller, we're looking at a lot of Glenn Miller records today, because this is a really good example. These songs were originally recorded in mono. And in the 60s especially, that's when the reprocessed fake stereo was at its heyday. The trendy thing was stereo. So at all costs, record companies were figuring out a way to market older music that was only recorded in mono. And so they came up with a process to do that. The problem is that collectors don't like it. And even music aficionados don't like it oftentimes because it just doesn't sound natural like the real thing. Well, again, we'll look at that in a minute. So how do you spot it? So if you're lucky, oftentimes it'll just say stereo effect reprocessed from monophonic. Now, if you ever see the word reprocessed and stereo in the same phrase, that's a sure bet that you're dealing with fake stereo. And so how do they take a mono recording and make it stereo? Well, the answer is they don't really do that. They don't really do that. I'm going to show you in just a minute exactly what they do. The idea is to give it sort of a quasi stereo effect, the old mono recordings, because you can't truly make a stereo recording out of mono unless you have individually mic'd instruments and things that you can remix, which is not the case for a lot of this mono music. This one has like a sticker after the fact put on here. Camden being an RCA subsidiary. Whenever you see that RCA logo, you know it's 70s era. So this is pretty late in the game for reprocessed stereo. But you can see right there, stereo effect, reprocessed from monophonic. And if you're lucky, you will be able just to look at it and tell. If you're not so lucky, sometimes they get a little bit tricky about how they do it, such is the case with this record. And at first glance, you're like, oh, stereo, great, it's a stereo record. But then wait a minute, looking a little closer, what does that say underneath there? Electronically reprocessed. So it's not even, true stereo in this case. And then sometimes you have to look on the back of the record. Sometimes it'll be down at the bottom, it'll be hidden. And in the case of some third-party record companies, they don't even mention it. So you'll get a record and you'll be like, okay, is this true mono or is this fake stereo or what is this? And it's not uncommon for there to be fake stereo. You can tell just by listening, but then it's like, great, I wanted the original mono recordings. In the case of Glenn Miller, collectors want the original mono recordings. So that's how they were mixed. That's how they were designed. And they just sound better. They're closer to you. The process of reprocessing fake stereo makes things sound more distant. And again, we're going to do a demonstration of that. So again, I wanted to show you a few variants of fake stereo records. Again, we got the RCA logo, Victor Stereo Effect reprocessed from monophonic. So that's a little bit more honest, I would say. It's an effect. This one, stereo electronically reprocessed, and you will notice that the catalog number has an E over there to let you know that it's electronically reprocessed. LSP stands for Living Stereo, but with a sort of a little asterisk next to it saying, but it's electronically reprocessed. And the same goes for this record as well. LSP, but it's an E. So it is stereo, but it's reprocessed stereo. Now that isn't to say that, there are real stereo records out there. This one says dual channel stereo, so that would be true authentic stereo. They couldn't say that and have it be reprocessed because that would be misleading. This is a really cool Glenn Miller record. It's actually by Jerry Gray, who was the arranger, one of the arrangers in the original Glenn Miller Orchestra. He went on to lead his own Glenn Miller style band after the war. These Mayfair records, some of them are pressed in this really cool kind of yellow transparent vinyl. I've got two of them here. But anyway, yeah, so stereo would still exist. You may be saying, well, I thought you said all Glenn Miller music was mono because it predated stereo. Well, yeah, and that's because these are new recordings by Jerry Gray. Such is the case with this one as well. Dual channel stereo, also on Mayfair. Mayfair records are also issued under the Tops label, and oftentimes the Tops label variants don't have the colored vinyl. Just something I've sort of learned in the process of collecting Glenn Miller records. So if we don't want fake stereo, and you can't have real stereo on some of these recordings, what do you want? Well, you want true mono. Now, as I said, the fake stereo fad was at its height in the 60s and very early 70s. By the late 60s, record companies got the drift that consumers wanted either real mono or real stereo. They didn't want sort of this amalgamation of something in between. So for the Glenn Miller collectors, you really want to find those late 60s or early 70s LPs if you're collecting true mono recordings. This is one volume. This is volume 5, 6, 7, 8 of the complete Glenn Miller from 1941 to 42. There's a multi-volume set. I think there's 12 in this set. I'm not 100% sure. It's a dual disc collection, and this one has had some usage. This is cool. It says it's a demonstration disc. It's not for sale. One of the reasons, as a quick aside here, that I love this set too is that they issue them with these reproduction vintage Bluebird labels. If you are a Glenn Miller or kind of early big band fan, you may know that Bluebird Records was an imprint, that's more publisher speak, but it was a label of RCA for their kind of popular jazz tunes. Pop music in the 30s and 40s was jazz music. So they started off big bands on Bluebird and then eventually moved them to the RCA Victor label. Such was the case of Glenn Miller. I think he went on Victor in 42, which, was because he was the biggest band in the country. So obviously he was going to go to their flagship label. But for the purpose of this set, they reproduced those beautiful Bluebird labels, and I love them so much. But this set has true mono. These are flat recordings with the same acoustics and ambience or lack thereof that they were recorded with originally. So it's going to sound a lot like the recordings on 78 that they were originally issued as, but even better. This particular set, this complete Glenn Miller set, was issued on vinyl in the 70s. That's what this is from. And it looks like it's a library issue based on this. And it was reissued on CD in 1991, which I have that CD as well. They're made from tapes made by a guy named Frank Driggs in the 1970s. And he made those tapes, which is good because when you duplicate metal parts, which these are from the metal parts for the most part, you're getting the source audio. You're getting the actual source audio. So as those metal parts deteriorate over time, you've kind of time-stamped when those were, obtained, and you're able to have that true source material. Hopefully that makes some sense. So other records, this is an example of a 60s era mono record on RCA, which are, like I said, not as common as they should be. This is the new Glenn Miller under the direction of Ray McKinley. So about the same time that Jerry Gray was leading his own band. So the official Glenn Miller band with the Glenn Miller name on the bandstands as well was being led by Ray McKinley. This is LPM, which stood for LP Mono. If you remember, we saw LSP earlier, but LPM is LP Mono. And it still says orthophonic high fidelity recording. So it can be still a high fidelity record, a hi-fi record, without being stereo, either fake or real. So here are some mono examples: RCA Victor, new orthophonic high fidelity, and LPM because it is mono. This is the I don't know why I put this one in here twice. This is one of these records like I somehow have like 3 or 4 copies, even though I've given some away. When I tell people who are interested in collecting Glenn Miller, I say this is a great first record to get. This is VPM 6019 Victor Mono. So they've sort of left the old naming and labeling conventions behind. Glenn Miller Memorial 1944 to 1969. If you know a little bit about Glenn Miller, you may be saying, why? What the heck? What are those years? And I was for some time. 1944 was the year he disappeared, passed away, and 1969 is when this came out. Apparently, there's some rare variants of this that say 1944 to 1970. And I've never seen those in person, but I've been told about them. Anyway, this is kind of a greatest hits. I wish it was branded differently because this sounds like it's a morbid, thing, like in memorial kind of a thing. But it is a great set, and it has great flat, true mono sound. And they made quite a bit of these. It was also issued on cassette and CD. I think 8-track as well. Okay, so what is fake stereo? Exactly how do they do it? I'm going to do my best to visually demonstrate it with the use of 2 camera batteries. This is a high-tech show, guys, spared no expense, but this should do the trick. So I want you to imagine one being a mono track going top to bottom, bottom to top. This is a monaural audio track. And 2 side by side as a stereo track. Okay? Now, if we are talking about real stereo, this would be the best representation. You've got 2 individual separate tracks side by side, obviously giving you real stereo. But in the case of fake stereo, your source audio is this, and you're trying to get to this. So how did they accomplish that? A couple of tricks. The first thing is they phase shifted it a bit. So the left and right tracks are slightly out of alignment. Slightly out of alignment. Again, we're trying to create, or they were trying to create, a stereo-like effect. And it does sound, you'll notice it. When we demonstrate it, you'll be like, yeah, I do hear that for sure. But they had only mono to work with. So they phase shifted the audio. Then they added reverb. And so that's the biggest thing. And sometimes it was just reverb. Sometimes it was all of these things. But the quickest thing you will notice is sort of a reverby, distant sound. And that was like the biggest hallmark of fake stereo. So we phase shifted, we've added reverb, and then finally they put a high pass filter on one channel and a low pass filter on the other channel. So that's the construct of fake stereo, to give you this in your head when you only have this to work with. And you do hear it. It does sound like something. It's definitely not true stereo, but it is something. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. This is a true mono RCA Victor Glenn Miller record. I am going to sort of skip through a little bit of each track so you can get it in your head what the mono sounds like. Now the fake stereo record we'll play after that isn't the exact same record, but there'll be some of the same songs and you'll definitely get the point. So let's start with true monophonic sound.
Dreams we fashioned when summertime was.
Okay, so that is the true mono. Now the fake stereo. Okay, I don't know if you guys saw the news today, but it looks like Marty McFly Jr. was arrested for theft, which is very unfortunate. Just messing with you. This is one of the props from this Back to the Future book I got with all these props, and I've been geeking out about Back to the Future lately. Haven't seen the movies in years, and I recently dove back in and just been having a blast with it. And I guess you could probably ascertain that based on some of the things I've been talking about lately. Anyway, that doesn't really have anything to do with today's show. Today's show, though, fake stereo. What did you think? Let me know in the comments down below. Could you hear a difference? I bet you could. And which do you prefer? I personally don't have a problem with fake stereo because it's not like that's the only version that's available. I have both versions of all of those Glenn Miller songs. So for me, it's something different to listen to, and it just doesn't bother me. There's some collectors that go ballistic when you bring up the topic of fake stereo and would never let that enter my house and all this stuff. I'm just not like that. But I'd be curious what you guys think about fake stereo. Do you have any fake stereo records in your collection? If you don't, where would you obtain those? Because new vinyl isn't going to have that. Thrift stores, antique stores, online, obviously. Also, if you were intrigued by the Glenn Miller music we played a little bit of today, I would be happy to welcome you into the world of Glenn Miller fandom. It's a wonderful world. A lot of cool things to discover as a record collector and as just a fan of upbeat, fun music. So consider yourself officially invited. Anyway, my friends, that's going to do it for today. So happy record hunting, and we'll see you next time.